Donald Trump just announced he is setting up a sovereign wealth fund for the United States.
President Donald Trump on Monday ordered the U.S. government to create, for the first time, a sovereign wealth fund within the next year.
Trump has already talked about potentially buying TikTok. What else will he buy? Bitcoin, gold, silver? And will this make Americans rich? I'm going to answer those questions for you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over how a sovereign wealth fund usually, I'm emphasizing that word on purpose. More on that in just a moment. How usually these things work. So we'll start with everyone's favorite. It is not the average Joe. It is his Saudi Arabian cousin. That is right, the average Muhammad right here. So he has all of these oil reserves, and he takes that oil, sells it out into the market, and then gets those dollars. Now, usually, for most of the countries with a sovereign wealth fund, this leads to a surplus because they pay off all their expenses. They have all these dollars left over. So they want to invest those dollars, get a return. We always hear about this with treasuries, but a lot of these sovereign wealth funds buy more than just treasuries. So if we look at the balance sheet, those dollars become assets, and the offsetting liability would be equity. Well, that's great. We want as much equity as we can get. And then what they do is they take those dollars and let's just say they buy the NASDAQ, they buy NVIDIA, Netflix, or US Treasuries. And that's how they're trying to get an additional return above and beyond just those dollars that are sitting on the asset side of their balance sheet. But before we move further, I want to point out that this is all stemming from an asset to begin with. This is why on net balance, you could argue that the people of Saudi Arabia are richer. Okay, now let's move forward to what's happening with Donald Trump. So again, he announces that the United States is also going to set up a sovereign wealth fund. Why not? Well, this is a little unusual because, as you guys know from watching my videos, the United States does not have a surplus. Not even close. We have a massive budget deficit. So where would we get the money to actually invest in buying TikTok or gold or silver or Bitcoin? Well, it would all start with Janet Yellen right here. She would sell treasuries into the marketplace, in other words, debt, and then she would take those dollars, give them to Donald Trump. That goes onto the asset side of the U.S. balance sheet. But notice the difference already. Instead of this being an equity position, now we have a treasury, we have debt. So we're funding this sovereign wealth fund not with an asset, but with debt. So if you look at our balance sheet, we don't have any equity. We've just expanded the size of the balance sheet. So what we're really talking about here is we're talking about not really a sovereign wealth fund. It's more like a hedge fund where we're borrowing a bunch of money and then we're investing that, hopefully get a return above and beyond what we have to pay for the debt. And I know a lot of you right about now are saying, well, George, what you're forgetting to talk about, the elephant in the room here, are the tariffs. This is going to generate a lot of tax revenue. We can go ahead and put into the fund and use those dollars to buy TikTok, gold, silver, Bitcoin, etc. And I get it, but what you need to understand is even if Donald Trump implements these tariffs, it's highly unlikely that they are going to lead to a budget surplus. We're still going to have that deficit. So let's just assume these tariffs generate $10 worth of revenue that can be used to go ahead and buy TikTok or whatever. Okay, fine. But that just means that Janet Yellen isn't going to have that $10 to use to pay for the expenses of the US government. So what is she going to have to do? She's going to have to issue another $10 worth of treasuries, another $10 worth of debt. So at the end of the day, you are still issuing debt to fund the quote-unquote sovereign wealth fund, where here in Saudi Arabia, it's much different because they are starting with an asset that is producing that cash flow that goes into the fund that then they use to invest. In this example, the people of Saudi Arabia, if you just look at their balance sheet, are absolutely 100% getting richer. In this example, the only way the American citizens are getting richer is if we have a very good sovereign wealth fund manager. I don't know that Stan Druckenmiller or Warren Buffett is up for the job, because you would need the return on the asset side of the balance sheet to exceed the interest that you're paying for the debt to begin with, or else it's a net loser for the American people. Whereas the only way the Saudi Arabian citizens are going to actually lose money is if the average Muhammad borrows money, uses leverage, and then the Netflix shares go down to a certain level where he has less money than he did to begin with. You see, this is a sovereign wealth fund. This is basically a sovereign hedge fund. Step number 2. Now let's go over what Trump might buy for his sovereign hedge fund. We'll call it the United States Sovereign Hedge Fund. So first and foremost, let's look at some news articles to get an idea of kind of what's going through the Donald's mind. You never really know. It can change from one day, well, actually 1 second to the next second. But what he has said in the past, as an example, right here from CNN, Trump wants to buy Greenland. Well, we all know that he's been talking about it quite a bit, and he's trying to negotiate for it, but maybe, just maybe, with the sovereign hedge fund, he would go ahead and purchase it outright. Maybe he would do the same thing with the Panama Canal. Maybe he would buy it back. So a lot of these, let's say, strategic assets that he's been eyeing, I'd put them right at the top of the list for this fund. But it's not just the strategic assets outside of the United States. He's also been talking about the monetary system quite a bit. Right here, we go to an article from the other day where Trump was talking about bringing back the gold standard. This article in particular says rumors that the gold standard could be reinstated during Trump's presidency centered largely on positive comments he made about the idea. Notably, he suggested it would be wonderful, quote unquote, to bring back the gold standard. And a number of his advisors are on the same page. Judy Shelton, John Allison, and others support the concept. But before he buys gold, I think he might actually buy crypto. Right here from NBC News, Trump orders administration to evaluate potential for national digital asset stockpile. So my base case is he would just take like the top 10 cryptos, and we'll just consider Bitcoin a crypto just for the sake of this example. And he would just buy the top 10, and that's what would go into the fund. It would almost be like a crypto version of an S&P 500 index. I think the big question is, would he buy Trump coin and would he buy Melania coin for this digital asset stockpile? Knowing Trump, I would have to say yes. If I was betting on it, I would be willing to bet that if he does a national digital asset stockpile for the sovereign hedge fund, that he would include a little bit of Trump in Melania coin. But we'll have to wait and see how this plays out. Now let's go over to an article from AOL where we get a quote from Trump's Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick. And this gives us insights as to how they might use the sovereign hedge fund in a way that's, let's just say, outside of the box. Creative thinking here. The extraordinary size and scale of the U.S. government and the business it does with companies should create value for American citizens. If we are going to buy, he's just using this as an example, 2 billion cerveza sickness medicines, maybe we should have some warrants and some equity in these companies and have that grow for the help of the American people. So I don't want to get too far off on a tangent, but I think right away you guys can tell how this would create an epic amount of moral hazard. So I don't want to dive down that rabbit hole for this video in particular, but I think this does show us that stocks are definitely on the table for the sovereign hedge fund. So are they going to buy the S&P 500, the Nasdaq? My guess is whatever they buy, it will most likely include AI stocks. And then you have to step back and ask yourself, do we want the government, especially after Trump, holding positions in all of these companies? We're walking a fine line there between free market capitalism and economic fascism. When I'm talking about fascism, I'm talking about the standpoint where you've got this relationship, let's say, where you do have companies that are privately owned, but they're really controlled by the government. And I know a lot of Trump fans out there watching this video say, oh, Donald Trump would never do that. No, I get it. I get it. But we have to realize that Trump's just going to be there for 4 years and we're going to get someone else after Trump. And that person could be like Joe Biden, someone who more favors socialist type of policies and would be very proactive in telling these companies how they should run their affairs, not necessarily for the benefit of the American people, but more so the benefit of the United States federal government, the central planners and authoritarians. But main takeaway from step number 2 is foreign assets definitely on the table. Let's say Greenland, Panama Canal, who knows what else Trump would like to negotiate or buy to get on the asset side of the United States balance sheet. And then obviously gold and silver. But before he bought gold and silver, I think it would most likely be a basket of cryptocurrencies. And then probably right at the top of my list would be just buying stocks outright, like we've seen them buy in Japan. And I think he'd probably focus on AI stocks. Step number 3. So will Americans get rich from the U.S. sovereign hedge fund? Well, to answer that question, we have to start by understanding what wealth actually is. Because you see, wealth isn't necessarily dollars. It's not gold. It's not Bitcoin. It's not silver. It's stuff, goods and services. Let me show you what I mean. An example I use all the time. Say you've got this deserted island right here, and it is not the average Joe. No, 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 no. It is actually the Stranded Joe, another one of his cousins. So Stranded Joe is on this deserted island, but the good news is he's got this chest full of gold, red gold, oddly enough. I don't have a yellow pen. But he's got $1 billion of gold in this chest. But on the flip side of the coin, he only has a palm tree and a couple of coconuts. So now I want to compare him to the average Joe. Let's say the average Joe balance sheet, he's got some dollars in there. He doesn't have any debt. So he's got $100,000, let's say, in his bank account. But he has access to all the goods at Home Depot, Walmart, Target. So who is richer? Stranded Joe with $1 billion worth of gold, but yet just 2 coconuts? Or the average Joe with only $100,000, but access to goods and services? Obviously, it's the average Joe. So the reason I bring this up is because it gives us a framework to look at what might happen with the proceeds from the sovereign hedge fund. And going back to step number 1, this assumes it'll actually make money. And that's a big assumption. Because unlike just taking the cash from an asset, what we're having to do is borrow the money. So remember, the asset side, or the return on the asset side of the balance sheet, would have to exceed the cost of the debt itself. And if it doesn't, then the American people have less money than they did to begin with. Well, let's just say for the sake of this video, it is able to turn quite a profit. We'll assume that Donald Trump got Stan Druckenmiller to actually manage this sovereign hedge fund. Will Americans get rich? Well, it depends. on what Trump actually does with the money. So let's think about this. If Trump were to take the proceeds, the profits from the hedge fund, and just distribute them to every single American or the average Joe, would that make him richer? Well, I don't know. Let's just assume the average Joe, instead of having 100,000 in his account, now has 200,000. But you say, George, in order to know if Joe got richer, I have to know what's happening with the amount of stuff. And that's a brilliant observation. Because if Joe just gets an extra $200,000, but there's not more goods and services in the economy, then the prices will just go up to a new high watermark. And Joe will just have to pay double for everything that he was buying before. Therefore, his purchasing power hasn't increased. But now for a moment, let's assume Trump takes the money and he spends it on infrastructure, but not just infrastructure projects that really move the needle. Because you could sit there and argue that China's ghost cities or Japan just building highways to nowhere. Those are infrastructure projects, but it's just a massive waste of scarce resources with alternative uses. As the Austrians would say, it's malinvestment. But assuming that we could invest in something to where there's actually a multiplier effect, let's just say putting in a highway between city A and city B, where now there's just a country road. Well, this would most likely lead to more goods and services. And if it leads to more goods and services, not just more currency units, then this would definitely make Americans richer. So the whole point with this step, and maybe the whole point with this video, is actually to prove that what real wealth is goods and services. It's not dollars, it's not gold, it's not increasing your wages, your income, Bitcoin, silver, etc. So when you're trying to think through what might happen in the future, and you're trying to think through all of these policies, I would encourage you to start from a position of just asking, is this going to increase goods and services, or is it going to decrease goods and services? Answer that question before you ask the question, is it just going to increase the amount of income going to the average American? Our priority should always be more goods and services, not more money. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here. I will see you on the next video.